Thank you everyone for coming for this amazing celebration that we are starting a little early today to make it intimate and nice. I know some of you came from very far, some of you came very close, but I know how busy everyone is, so I know also how important it is for all of us to be here tonight. So of course we are gathered here tonight to celebrate together Dr. David Leatherbarrow's 2020 Topaz Medal Awards. And this has been 2 years in coming, obviously, because I'm not going to actually say why. We all know why, right? And, you know, it's a huge blessing to be here in person and to actually do this together while sitting in a chair in a room together. The Topaz Medallion honors those who educate others to ensure architecture's enduring excellence. This award, jointly presented by the AIA and the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, called the ACSA, recognizes outstanding individual contributions in architectural education. It's presented to an individual who has had a significant impact on architectural education and the discipline and practice of architecture. It's the highest award the organizations make to an educator and reflects their joint commitment to recognize service to the profession, academy, and society. David's own path to excellence started with his BR graduate degree of the University of Kentucky, followed by a PhD in art from the University of Essex, England. Leatherbarrow began his teaching career at Cambridge University and the University of Westminster. Since joining the faculty of the University of Pennsylvania Stuart Weitzman School of Design, which of course it wasn't then, it was just the University of Pennsylvania School of Architecture, I think, or Department of Architecture. But 1984, Leatherbarrow has led programs first-year studio, required first-year semester for the school's doctoral program, and during his tenure, he has also served 2 stints as associate dean and department chair. We could not get enough of David. And spent 2 decades as the 2 decades, I'm just repeating that, 2 decades as the PhD program chair, graduate group chair. When he was interviewed after the receiving of the Topaz Medal, and he was asked, what is the most memorable moment of your teaching career? Of course, that was the first thing I read. He answered, the graduation of a PhD student who had years earlier told me tearfully that the course of study was far too difficult for her to ever complete a dissertation. But shortly after graduation, her dissertation was published as a book that later won many, many prizes. I thought it was a really fabulous note. I mean, and it's also something we all feel very close to many moments in our lives. His excellence in research was also celebrated in publications, and over this time, Leatherbarrow has written 11 books, 140 scholarly essays and articles. I'm quite sure it's more now, but that was 2020, and has appeared more than 100 times at conferences, often in a keynote speaker role, according to the medallion announcement. He has written many, many books, among which Building Time Architecture Event and Experience, 20th Century Architecture, 3 Cultural Ecologies with Richard Wesley, Architecture Oriented Otherwise, Topographical Stories, Surface Architecture with Motion Mostafavi, Uncommon Ground, Roots of an Architectural Invention, and on Weathering, the Life of Buildings in Time. I think that's probably all our favorites, one of the favorite books of most people. His latest work, 3 Cultural Ecologies by Routledge in 2017, was written also together with Richard Wesley and assesses certain works by Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright. My own history, I'll keep this very short, David, because we have a long history. I can see David looking worried, which started, and this is something I usually don't talk about, in 1995. When I was hired by Marco Frascari to teach in the DOE, and I actually recently asked Richard in a meeting, like, what is the difference between the DOE and where you are now with undergraduate? I won't go into that. But it was super interesting together with Sol Jaboui, and I was very young. I was 3 years out of Columbia University. But then a year later, I ended up with David in the show 1996 in the MArc. And yeah, there we are, still here, we could say. But I think mostly, if I fast forward to 2013, when I was told that it was a good idea to apply to be the chair, I remember being interviewed by then interim chair David Leatherbarrow. And I said to David, because I was slightly mortified about this job, which is probably rightfully so, I said to David, listen, I am only doing this if I am offered this, if you work me in. And David graciously said, after thinking for a moment, I remember that moment very well. He said, if you decide to do that and we all agree that you go forward, I will work you in. And I have to say that was not only a great promise, it was also a great reality, because that really helped me through a lot of very big hurdles in the beginning. I was a practice professor, so the academy was known to be, but not in every aspect of many things such as tenure and promotions and other beautiful things that the Academy has. I think this is a great moment to thank maybe more than just David, because I had, during my tenure, and I'm almost saying goodbye at this point to you, in my 9th year. Should I just continue? No. I have to also say that all the ex-chairs, David, Bill, and Richard, were my committee of ex-chairs, or I call them my ex-men, man in black. And I have to really thank all of you in the biggest possible way, because the job of a chair is enormous. I have the biggest possible respect for all of you, especially after all this, but also really, really great how all of you have really helped put this department together and the growth we've gone through. So I think, yeah, I just wanted to take this moment also to thank Bill and Richard, but especially also you, David. And with that, I think chairs never should speak too long. I would like to give the word to Dean Fritz Steiner, who will continue from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Winka. Well, when I was a PhD student in planning here, I came in 1983, so there's going to be a quick connection here. I actually was much better friends with the architecture students than the planning students. I suppose that requires a bit of explanation. Part of it was because I'd been teaching at a place called Washington State University in Palouse, and I can remember when I for the first time drove my wife from Seattle to Pullman, and she had come from Warsaw and Stockholm, and we got to a place called Royal City, which was neither royal or a city, and she burst into tears. And the architecture and landscape architecture and planning community at Washington State University and the University of Idaho formed a really strong bond, because we were in two different universities, different schools. And so one night at a party, a friend named Bob Barron said, you know, I've been thinking about going back and getting a PhD. And I said, well, so have I. What are you thinking about? And he said, Penn. And I said, me too. So we talked ourselves into doing that. We became fast friends, and through Bob, I got to know most of the architecture students, doctoral students at the time. And up to that point, of course, the sort of star in the doctoral program was Marco Foscari, and I heard so many Marco Foscari stories. And he's, I think most people know, was a wry Italian architect and theorist who went on then to teach at both Virginia Tech and Carleton. So when it was announced that David was coming, there was this buzz that was created among the architecture students, the doctoral students. After he arrived, that buzz continued and grew. I left Penn to return teaching at the Northwest, but then I started to follow David's writing. And a lot of his work is really relevant to my own because he wrote about time, about weathering, about a lot of issues I don't think many architecture theorists normally focus on. Well, of course, Vitruvius wrote about time in the context of architecture, but that was a long time ago. David's work really expanded the scholarship and thinking in architecture. The idea that architecture is impermanent, that stayed with me for decades. You think about the most important buildings, and you can't deny the element of time for their existence. Take falling water. It would have literally fallen in the water decades ago if it wasn't owned by very wealthy people who quite literally prop it up. As landscape architects know very well, time is also an opportunity. We can't design a landscape without understanding the future of the species that will be growing on the site. Seen over time, David wrote, the materials of landscape continually renew themselves. David's writing about landscape is just so spot on. One of my favorite things he did was a short essay in 2015. The essay is titled, and I required for my students, the essay is titled, Is Landscape Architecture? It's just a sort of topic that David excels in, a kind of cone that seems to both state and question the obvious, but it turns out to be a new way of understanding reality. True to form, David goes straight to the heart of the matter in the first paragraph, then crystallizes 300 years of architecture history and theory. The question, he says, is really about the relationship between two arts that are normally understood as separate professions. But architecture, urban design, and landscape architecture are deeply connected. The three can't be separated any more than geometry and physical fact, shape and substance when we're talking about a building and its site. Architecture, urban design, and landscape are what David calls the topographic arts. They provide a prosaic patterns of our lives with durable dimension and beautiful expression, he wrote. The Topaz Medallion, which was awarded to David in 2020, and what does that, when you say 2020, it's sort of, we're at March 2020, and we were all going to go to ACSA and AIA to celebrate, and then of course 2 weeks turned into 2 years. Anyway, the Topaz Medallion was awarded to David in 2020, and it's given, I think, quite significantly by both the American Institute of Architects and the Association of Collegiate Schools of Planning. Sorry, that's creeped in there. It's like Texas creeps in every once in a while. It's the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architects, of course. If it was jointly offered by ACSP and AIA, that would be totally revolutionary. But I think just that it's AIA and ACSA is extremely noteworthy. It's the only kind of award of its kind and singles a universal admiration in both the academic and practice communities. Now, the people that have received the Topaz are among the most important educators of our time. And Penn has had an incredible record of Topaz winners, from Holmes Perkins to Denise Scott Brown, Lee Copeland, and Adele Santos. What is the Topaz Medallion for? It's very simple. According to the jury, architecture's future depends on its next generation of leaders and the educators who impact their lives. As for David's impact, David, you have given all our lives a durable dimension and beautiful expression. As you can tell, I'm a fan. Congratulations, David. And someone is coming up next, I think, is Franca.
Good evening and welcome to all on this most joyous occasion. We're celebrating David. I don't imagine a more joyous event than that. Now, I stand in front of you tonight with a really humble task to honor my teacher, my mentor, my colleague, and a friend. This evening, we're going to hear a great deal about David's contributions, so I'm going to keep my own comments particularly focused on my exchanges with David in the PhD program, where I was a student, a graduate, and I find myself a graduate group chair. But you don't have to believe what I'm going to say about David and his impact. Of course, the Topaz Medallion makes that pretty evident and is proof enough. I actually looked at some illustrious siblings that David is going to have in his family, or that has in his family, including Marcel Breuer, Colin Rowe, John Heddick, Charles Moore, Kenneth Frampton, Jersey Sultan, Stanford Anderson, Edward Allen, Stanley Tigerman, Michael Graves, George Baird, Robert Stern, Jorge Silvetti, Toshihiko Mori, and Deborah Burke, just a few. And we've already heard about our own colleagues here at Penn who were awarded the medallion. Now, David's special contributions, however, are entirely worth signaling outside of that incredible family, and even if they're impossible to capture in just 5 minutes. Indeed, just how impossible this task is all the more apparent when one sets out to name and identify the decades, of learning that I and others have benefited from in his presence, in hearing him lecture, in reading his writings, and when engaging him in conversation. Now, because I'm sometimes nerdy, numbers and metrics might help us identify David's impact on the Penn community. 4 decades, 1,500 lectures, 1,500 M.Arch students that he has taught over the years. With the fact that he has influenced and inspired hundreds of doctoral students, many of whom are now teaching in Korea, Thailand, Lebanon, Morocco, Canada, Brazil, Colombia, Turkey, Denmark, Norway, Germany, England, Italy, China, those are the folks that I know, and of course the countless schools in the US that have faculty members that have been taught by David. We've already noted his 140 papers, which I'm sure are more by this point, and of course his dozen books. Now yet these numbers, even if they are incredibly impressive, offer but the most superficial of answers to the question of David's impact on the field of architectural history and theory. Numbers are incapable of capturing the commitment, intensity, and ethics of his practice. A practice that's grounded in buildings, topographies, surfaces, and materials. A practice that's inspired by time, narrative, configurations, and cultural ecologies, and a practice that's embedded in ideas, philosophy, representation, and the imagination. Now, to further address what I believe are the ethics of David's practice, I've decided to focus these remaining remarks on one particular aspect of his practice in the PhD program. And to do so, I'm going to adopt an intellectual ruse that I've borrowed from the work of 20th century English historian of the Renaissance, Dame Frances Amelia Yates, whose 1966 book, The Art of Memory, speaks to the intellectual history of human memory. That pretty necessary faculty that was held by philosophers, scholars, writers, politicians, and anyone who's interested in rhetoric, obviously I'm not using it tonight, and who happened to live prior to the printed book. Now, Yates's text on the history of mnemonic devices traces the many ways that humans have sought to remember forms of knowledge that are valuable, that are worthy to share, but that have to be stored in one's mind. Now, needless to say, these techniques for remembering information, conversations, experiences, narratives, and histories were honed at a time when texts, books, and publications were rare and available to only the select few. The art of memory would not have been invented in a technological horizon such as ours, with its ubiquitously easy access to digital printing, the internet, and Twitter. After all, there's very little need for mnemonic devices in a world where everything that we might possibly want to know is available to us in bits and bytes on Google. So why, therefore, would I take this opportunity to celebrate David and reference this arcane art of memory, a mental, intellectual, and imaginative practice known to the ancient Greeks, the Renaissance, occult philosophers, and 17th century mathematicians? Well, I have three reasons. The first is because central to the art of memory is the ability for scholars to build an architecture of the mind, which is to say, for many who practice the art of memory, they did so by collecting and storing ideas that were conjured in their imagination in architectonically significant spaces. The terracing of Greek theaters and the plan of a well-known building, for example, were figural tools that were used to store one's thoughts. Upon each terrace and within each room, the scholar positioned a memory, an argument, a principle for future retrieval. In the same way that one entered and exited a building, one could call upon, in imaginary space-time, to recall the ideas that had been stored on each terrace and in each room. Now, you would be right to ask why I'm referencing this arcane form of knowledge in the context of David's achievements at Penn. Well, maybe because the ability of scholars to create mental maps of the built environment for the purposes of communicating intellectual values, ideas, and reflective thoughts is essential to the practice of architectural history and theory. Maybe because a culture's capacity to configure, and represent with intent and meaning built space is also essential to the practice of architectural history and theory. Indeed, it might be said that David's scholarship is marked by his dedication to the kinds of mental mappings that help us bind the built environment in all its constructions and locations to the world of ideas upon which it's predicated. Indeed, it might even be said that David's scholarship clearly manifests his cultivation of a definition of architecture that is contingent on meaningful representations. We need only recall the careful pairing of paintings and buildings that animate the structure of building time. All right, I'm going to wrap up. The second reason I've taken this opportunity to speak to the art of memory is the role that David has played in helping us all construct our own intellectual maps of architecture. Indeed, many are the places or the loci that David has captured in his teachings, places that I return to very often. The first of these places happens to be a physical space known as the G. Holmes Perkins Rare Book Room, located directly below us in the Fisher Fine Arts Library. This room houses hundreds of rare and fragile books and manuscripts written by architects as early as the 17th century, actually the 16th century. I want to get that right. This is where David chose to host his PhD seminar for years, with students huddled around a common table, freezing as it was, for the room is kept, I know who's laughing, yeah. Freezing as it was, for the room is kept at glacial temperatures for the purposes of keeping the books from decaying, and us as well, I guess. But it was here that we shared in the exchange of ideas far older than all of us put together. We read and interpreted text after text, bringing to life the spatial, cultural, and environmental and material concerns of architects who had practiced hundreds of years earlier. Individuals whose name would surely be lost to history if not for our efforts in speaking their names. Individuals who struggled with many of the very same questions confronting our students today. It was here that I found my dissertation on Giovanni Battista Piranesi, or rather, it found me. Now, the second place or loci that David's teachings transport us is that of architecture's imagination. Time and time again, his writings anticipate the most animated and eloquent of spatial and material imaginaries. Whether he lectures on concepts of construction and cultivation in Neutra's VDL House, Kaufman House, or Plywood House, or the integration of earthwork and framework in the work of Billy Tsen and Todd Williams in La Jolla, California, or on topography and horizon in the work of Le Corbusier, or the use of architectural openings by Eileen Gray, or the use of terrain in the work of Sven Fenn. I'm going to stop. We're often, in each of these instances, transported in our imagination. Now, certainly, it would have been fabulous to have had David physically guide us through these incredible works of architecture, but in the presence of his words, we travel and journey to places no less real for being in our minds. Inscribed in deep memory are the traces of a spatial and architectonic craft and art, of textual description and interpretation that only David could deploy when bringing to life project after project. His words are bricks. His words are lines. His words are spaces. And his words are places. Okay, so the third and final reason that I've taken this opportunity to remind us of the art of memory is that it teaches us that only that which is truly worth keeping and repeating is worth saying. So luxury, waste, and trivial thoughts are untenable when practicing the art of memory, and hence, I'm just going to keep it to a very, very brief reading of David's own writing as a demonstration of his own practice. So in the third chapter of Building Time, when he writes about an incredible building, the Louisiana Museum in Copenhagen, just outside of Copenhagen, he writes about pacing and spacing. He says, in architecture, some types of settings offer their contents all at once, others successively. Instances of the first type await one's arrival or return, fully prepared with all their parts in place to be used in the typical activities of everyday life, without demanding much attention. Examples of the second, successive type, through which we move at varying speeds, are known in passing. Often they are laid out to join the still spaces together. Not only do they link places together, they join times. When one is moving along a passage or walk, behind means no longer, and ahead indicates not yet. Despite their occasional overlaps, still and passing spaces indicate in a preliminary way two distinct temporalities in architecture: the time of present circumstances and the time of incremental unfolding. My time is over. Thank you, David.
Maybe I have a little less to say, but you'll hear from me again later. So the title of this short little paper is Stop, Look, Listen, Think. I first met David 20 years ago, I think, when I was teaching at the School of Architecture at UCD, and he had come as an external advisor of some kind to participate in some kind of quality assessment audit. So it was not the most auspicious introduction. He came in as a secret agent, or as a spy of some kind. But we quickly found each other, crossing the boundaries of bureaucracy, and we became friends, good friends, long-lasting friends. I wanted to just say something about that kind of friendship, having heard John Haydock's name mentioned here. I remember hearing John Haydock speak about his friendship with Alvin Boyarsky. It's one of these transatlantic friendships. And he mentioned that when he was put to the pin of his collar, he couldn't say whether they had met 12 times or 20 times, but no more than 20 and no less than 12. And yet, I'm sure in my mind that I've probably met David no more than 20 times and no less than 12. But friendship crosses those kind of time boundaries. And we've met in various teaching settings on both sides of the Atlantic. I've been here, he's been there, and we've met in many places in between, in places we've both been teaching. We've turned up in each other's worlds. But in my particular world, in my responsible world at UCD, my students have always enjoyed his attentive presence at those crucial mid-stage thesis reviews. So I wanted to say something about what I learned about his style or his character or his quality as a teacher from my students' point of view, to sum him up. And then I remembered a road safety jingle that used to be broadcast on TV when I was a schoolboy. It simply said, "Stop, look, listen, think before you cross the road. And I thought, that's what David does. He does not rush in. He stops to look. He waits to listen. He takes his time to think. And then, most helpfully, most disarmingly, he simply repeats to the student what he understands them to have said. Except it's not what they have said. It's what they wished they could have said. And now, having heard him give clear voice to their conscious or unconsciously hidden intentions, they can face the path ahead. The way to the river has been cleared for them by David's divining rod. He has fortified the proposition, and our students feel empowered to continue with their work. This, I think, is his gift, at least in my studio. His gift, this stopping, this listening, this thinking on the spot. It's a gift of intellectual curiosity. It's a gift of intellectual generosity. It's a positive gift. And of course, as you all know, it continues into his research and his writing. He sets the same pattern, steers the same course, when he brings us deep into his theories of time of the world, time of the body, time of the project. He returns time and time again to Caesar's swimming pool, but he doesn't dive in. He stops, he looks, he listens, he thinks, and some of Caesar's mysteries are revealed. Even in his own thoughtful lectures, David gives the impression of listening while he speaks, and we are inspired to listen with him. And so this is what I meant when I wrote these 40 words for the blurb on the back of his building time. Leatherbarrow focuses his meditative attention on lasting works of art and architecture, discussing paintings and projects with particular sensitivity to light and material. He perceptively reveals changes wrought by three kinds of time. Working like a clockmaker, patiently disassembling architectural mechanisms into their component parts, he explains how buildings operate in time. I'm sure, like many here, I feel I've learned so much from those time-taking explanations, and I'm here to pay my respects, to remind him of my friendship, and to join with you in congratulating David on his Topaz Medallion.
Well, I too am here to remind David, my friend. David, as you might remember, our friendship began in London, where we had Joseph Rickford and Dalibor Wesley as our history theory professors, though at different times, taking us through upheavals of phenomenological thought. Later, it gave us a lens which, though might have thickened or thinned with time and in different places, in different ways that we practiced or rethought them, nevertheless, I believe, became critical in the development of our disciplinary thinking. To find ourselves reading Walter Benjamin, Panofsky, Witkover, Ricker, etc., or Merleau-Ponty, I know David's favorite, in the library of the Royal Academy in London, or as Joseph's habit would have it, following him to the Fortnum and Masons across the road for afternoon tea, much more elegant than either of us were used to. Still, a major part of our friendship followed at Penn. Later, when I was invited to teach at Penn, David and I taught a studio together. It was a lot of fun. Enjoyed one of the first Penn Chinese students, have a very distinct memory of him, in our class, who blew us over by citing Kierkegaard he had fully read in Chinese. I'm sure you remember that, yes. My time at Penn since has been very much an important intellectual friendship, which we have shared with Joseph Rickwert, Marco Frascari, Richard Wesley, Mawson, and as well as other London friends who have visited occasionally. David's teaching here, leading the PhD department, and of course history and theory, both graduate and undergraduate courses, of course been invaluable and a critical part of the school. I feel it no matter my sporadic absences. Not to speak of his regular publication of books on architecture, which brought close reading of buildings and ideas together. His recent Topaz Medal is indeed a testimony to his achievement as a teacher and a recognition of the highest esteem that he has garnered among the students and colleagues. One of my students told me recently, in the studio actually, completely unsolicited, how he thought David was his best teacher. This is a student, in the context of a studio. Nevertheless, she thought that David taught her so much, and that was her favorite student, teacher. So David's presence, his organized thought, his knowledge of history and interest in ideas, and what was new to him, his incessant reading and teaching, not to speak of his playful sense of humor and wit, has been an inspiration to many of us among colleagues. Though he claims, half in jest, that he is stopping to write better books, well, haha. We know that this delicate refrain won't wash. I'm sure that the school would love to have him continue for as long as possible, so hopefully he won't let us miss him. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm not quoting Vitruvius, but I am using slides. Can we have the first slide, please? Oh, I have to do it. Oh. There we are. David has always, it seems, addressed subjects and topics from unusual perspectives. And indeed, in Architecture Orientated Otherwise, from 2009, he explained that he wished to take a stand against the various ways of conceiving the building as a self-sustaining and internally defined product of design. That book contains a range of what could be accomplished to take a stand against buildings being pictorial or picturesque, to realize that all sites, even buildings, performed. And performance means not only how it performs, but the audience for which it performs. And that includes the surrounding landscape, its topography. Events, David wrote, require locations. But he had, I think, always seen that an approach otherwise was valuable and important. It reminds me of what Ian Forster said of the Alexandrian poet Constantin Cavafy, whom I much admire, that he was always, and I quote, seen at a slight angle to the universe. David also sees the architectural universe at an angle, sometimes slight, always subtle, sometimes quite deliberate. And these mark his work at almost every turn by seeing something otherwise. A recent essay David published in 2020 was for a collection on thinking the sculpture garden, published by Routledge. Its theme throughout was not the sculptural object, standing alone, tout seul, but the plinth or pedestals on which it had to be placed. And here are two images David took in the Louisiana Museum, north of, if you can see them, I can't, Copenhagen. I had not really thought of that. Getting Franklin off his plinth in front of College Hall would be disaster in many respects, cultural, political, and aesthetic. But then I fantasized as a result of his essay that dozens of institutions throughout the world could start removing, as if they had not already started to do so, unwanted personages, but not, of course, Ben Franklin, and so leave wonderfully just the plinths, a plethora of empty pedestals, a sure system of association, in short, a new topic of plinthology. It seemed a new idea for me, yet recalling the underlying theme of David's roots of architectural invention, I realized that he had long sought the origins, the roots of new ideas. One of his talents as a historian is to discern, applaud, and recognize inventive work and its antecedents. And looking back through his previous works, I found many pedestals, here Neutra and Alexander's plinth for a kindergarten in LA, in a chapter in Uncommon Ground, unsurprisingly entitled Back to Front or About Face. And I thought that plinthology would embrace Ian Hamilton Finley's one of his many earth plinth moves, encircling a tree trunk with a McCollum base. But that led me further back into thinking about parks. And now I want to be a little more serious. Pulling up of roots. And go back to one section of David's 1983 dissertation, when he focused on garden art or placemaking by writing about how topography conceals itself. And it was reprinted by Penn Press in his Topographical Stories in 2004. This chapter, intricate and explanatory in ways I have no time to unpack here, has been a huge influence upon my own thinking about landscape architecture. David's grasp of how to view the geometry of nature through perspective has become a constant guide for understanding of placemaking. He invoked the frontispiece from Shaftesbury's Characteristics of 1714 to reveal how early gardens sought to instruct their users on how to appreciate unmediated natural forms beyond the garden, a somewhat difficult move than Finley's column bases on trees, yet similar. David's understanding of Shaftesbury depended on a current notion of perspective, and the frontispiece, which I show you here, and a detail of it, showed its author, I presume Shaftesbury, standing in an architectural portico and gazing across a series of gardens, some very geometrical, others far less so, to reach what Shaftesbury himself saw as the unmediated yew tree wood beyond. The point was not that a natural garden was ideal. It's a paradoxical phrase anyway, but that natures in the plural had to be understood for what David writes, for their different identities and natural products. And Shaftesbury might have got that notion from a very earlier plan in 1672 of his own house in Wimbledon Downs, where a constructed wilderness, which I've rather crudely marked in this slide, is marked in the garden spaces, as more to its left is a social bowling green. This perspective, this declension of different natures, has over many years after Shaftesbury been reinvented and rethought. Think of Olmsted's Prospect Park, where a variety of natures are clearly presented to the education of its visitors. What David brought out in Shaftesbury has proved a wise mode of understanding landscape maneuvers by later designers and users. If you can see a lot of natures or all of natures in one view, that's fine. If not, keep it in your mind. Whether Olmsted grasped the roots of this landscape architecture and invention is unlikely, but David's explorations provide us with a much more subtle and wiser narrative of garden history. David has always been, to his friends, his students, and his colleagues, most wise. And I hope, and I think we're seeing it this evening, that we all properly appreciate that wisdom. But I, for one, am very glad of his other skill, to have been otherwise.
So I may have slightly misread the invitation, thinking that these remarks were to come after the reception. Maybe the lights were a little lower. David was maybe a little more receptive to the things I'm going to say. I've known David Leatherbarrow for over 30 years, first as a teacher, then as a colleague, and I've spent some part of all those years in one bar or another, with one colleague or another, discussing what Leatherbarrow said or meant or was thinking. Many of his phenomenological observations, such as hardness is the resistance to intentionality, could yield hours of discussion. But to fully appreciate him, I believe that we must return to the leather itself. In recognition of the awarding of the Topaz Medallion, I want to recall a couple of Leatherbarrow moments which exemplify David as a teacher. We all seem to have to give a little bio in here to position ourselves. I returned to Penn in the late 1980s after nearly a decade of practice in New York. Mine was the postmodern generation, tasked with rethinking our relationship to modern architecture, and I had reached a moment of crisis after completing an especially colorful building in Central Park that left me even more confused about architecture. I got a call from a former teacher, Marco Frascari, who said, "You have to come back. Everyone is here." By which he meant Joseph Rickward, Mohsen Mustafavi, Homa Farjadi, Richard Wesley, Ivan Illich, and of course, David Leatherbarrow. It was an astonishing constellation of talent, of the kind that can only last until other opportunities pull them away. Mohsen was already gone before I started my studies, but Rickward, Frascari, and Leatherbarrow, but with Rickward, Frascari, and Leatherbarrow as the core of the PhD program, it became the brightest spot in architectural history and theory of its day. Their styles of teaching could hardly have been more different. Rickward was a tutor and would arrive to ask the class what they were reading and what they wanted to talk about. And if the conversation lagged, he might just leave early. Frascari was a kind of mage, casting spells and telling stories, but Leatherbarrow was the master of the theory seminar, which met in the rare book room, the cold one you've already heard about, and built steadily, week after week, on close readings from the great chain of architect authors, from Vitruvius to Venturi, as we used to say. His mastery of the canon seemed complete, and initially it was one of the most intimidating rooms I had ever entered. But it quickly became our own exclusive book club, a family of happy inquiry. I only took the course once, but I sat in on parts of it every year that I was in the program. Now, the particular Leatherbarrow moment, which he won't remember, the particular Leatherbarrow moment that has stayed with me all these years was when I was tasked with presenting some difficult text, and at one particularly tough passage, I asked Leatherbarrow what it meant. I remember his thoughtful words to this day. He looked at me and he said, "I don't know." Good, that was my laugh line, thank you. Of course he knew, but that was when I learned that he wasn't there to demonstrate his knowledge, but to help us find out for ourselves. That moment has really stayed with me and has come back to me many times as I faced my own students, and then my son, and learned to restrain my urge to be the smartest person in the room. It was a vital lesson then and now, and I have paid tribute to David many times by not knowing and by helping others find their own answers. The second moment occurred many years later when I was department chair and would have a monthly lunch with Leatherbarrow and Wesley to get their insights, what Winka called the X-Men. We had been colleagues for decades by that time, but those lunches were very like being back in the rare book room, where I would present whatever initiative or issues were on the departmental agenda. I actually think of those sessions as my own seminar in academic leadership, in which I eventually learned that leadership in the academy is something different than the management and administration that goes along with it. The moment for that particular insight came when I presented my approach to a controversial topic, neatly phrasing it, or so I thought, so that the opposing groups in the faculty could both read their views into it, right? Effectively saying nothing. In response, Leatherbarrow asked me, and I quote, if I thought words mattered. What a thing to say. To someone who'd spent all those hours reading books in his seminar. But he had a point. There are situations that call for negotiation and accommodation, but a chair has to stand for something, we know this. The chair has to stand for something, and publicly, so that faculty and students can shape their own views by agreeing or disagreeing. Modern universities exist to foster open discussion, a mission which has only become more important and more challenging in this polarized political climate. No one who has read David's many books can have any doubt about what he believes or what he cares about. But he is also always ready to debate those views, to demonstrate that words do matter, not just once, but every time you say them. To conclude, there is a particular practice that might help us understand the essential Leatherbarrow. You know, at home, late at night, with his slippers on. I knew that picture would draw a laugh. If you look at the inside front cover of almost any book that David has lent you, there is a neat list, written in pencil, with page numbers and the key points of the book. It is effectively an outline of what would be expected if you were asked to present a text in the seminar, and it models the intellectual rigor that is expected. Let me note here, David has a lot of books. Lauren's nodding, which means that there are a lot of points recorded in the inside front covers of his library, to which I think all of his former students would like access. And I could suggest here, perhaps there is a volume of Leatherbarrow's notations yet to be published. But more importantly, that practice has been passed on to many, if not most, of his students. I briefly thought I was unique because I put the notes in the inside back cover of my books, but the lesson he has passed on is not where you put them, of course, but that you don't put the book back on the shelf until you have understood it, completed the summary, and prepared to discuss it in public. Thank you, David.
My history with David is a complex one. David, in fact, hired me, possibly at the prodding of our mutual friend, Marco Frascati, with whom I had been teaching at Georgia Tech. A long time ago, that was 1993. The school was then known as the Graduate School of Fine Arts, a rather crusty, anonymous name that I'm sure pleased David's sense of avoiding notoriety. On Weathering the Life of Buildings in Time was newly published, which was how most of us knew David, the essay which coaxed us into thinking explicitly and implicitly about time and material. I arrived to my interview with David, who was chair then, surrounded by his books, in the northwest corner of Meyerson then. I was terribly jet-lagged as I had flown in from Paris, and David asked me one of his famously obtuse questions that would prompt and evaluate my ability to understand questions below the surface. I think I passed, as I was hired as an assistant professor, most likely against the objections of Peter McCleary, who is now a great friend. I'll never know, but all things change. Indeed, the next year, when David asked me to tell him what a new graduate coming out of Penn should know about site design, this is after he'd asked me to coordinate the site studio, I had learned his tricks, and I said glibly, curb cuts. I don't think that pleased him as much. Tonight we are honoring David as a teacher, and when I sat down to write this, I realized this would be quite difficult, as I was never David's student, at least in classes and seminars. And to be honest, David and I have disagreed on some central aspects of pedagogy, certainly not in the inclusion of overt formal speculation in the teaching of design to students. I'm sure David has questioned his decision to hire me at many points because of this. I remember David standing behind me when I was giving a student a desk crit in the era of digital scripting as design process and saying with a growl, "That looks like a doily." But David and I have always agreed on a few essentials: the curation of construction and the manifestation of the project, both of us fearing the descent into the supposed purity of the abstract object, rather than the site, even the landscape, to be more expansive. We both believe deeply in contamination. Fundamentally, we've also agreed on the topic that brings us here tonight, the centrality of the student in our professional education, the linchpin that communication to students is as central to the formation of thoughts. I was just speaking about this to one of our mutual friends, Catherine Bonnier, my thesis student, his dissertation student, now a tenured professor at Carleton, who could not be here tonight. And she phrased this so perfectly, so exquisitely, that I'm compelled to read it. In 2002, I wrote a letter supporting Professor Leatherbarrow for a Provost Award. I praised his patience and thoughtfulness and expressed my gratitude for what I called his, quote, sharp illuminations. A decade later, I want to try to explain these Leatherbarrowian illuminations through a metaphor that may make sense to no one. In the distant past, I attended a Gaelic language school on the west coast of Ireland. We followed what you might call embodied educational experiences. The most powerful of these were orienteering expeditions without maps or a compass, with one leader carrying a flashlight to guide the children through the fog of moonlit bogs or into the rifts of watery seaside caves. The leader would narrate, slowly and speaking only in Irish, each of their steps, shining their single light to illuminate safe places to tread, moving at an even pace, speaking clearly and without exhortation. In this patient process, the language and patterns of Gaelic began to make sense, and we learned to watch and listen carefully and to trust and help each other as we move through difficult terrain with increasing confidence. The paths would evolve with each step because our guides were also learning as they moved forward with us. It's beautiful. When I look back on David's teaching, it was the same pace and calmness and similarly encouraged, co-created, careful habits of speech, thought, and observation. Rather than shining a light on a solid spot of ground, he would hold up an image or moment or phrase, a building or painting or idea, and turn it around, describing it, testing it, trying it. When you're familiar with his writings, you know the evenness and ease with which he guides the reader, stringing together a series of illustrative points. His teaching operates similarly. At the PhD level, he would send us off into a bog to teach as we learned, to test and try our paths, offering correction only if we were headed into very deep mud. My sense of decorum usually falls short, but I try to be as consistent, generous, thoughtful, and patient as David when I invite my own students to walk with me through the fortunate explorations that I have embarked on through his examples. I will always be grateful to David for the methods of engagement that he taught and embodied. I'll leave it there.
So David and I first met in scripto, not in person. We each wrote an essay for a journal being edited by Joseph Rickwert. The journal was Rosagna. The subject was Nature in the Garden. David did an article on the roof garden, and I did an article on the cubist garden. I was teaching with Joseph Rickwert at the time at Harvard, and he said to me, "You really need to get to meet this guy." And I said, "Well, maybe someday we will." We eventually came here. Been a number of comments about that. And I wanted to say a bit about David's teaching. As you know, there will be an event focused on his writing, which is a fest shift, which is a celebration of writings, and there's a poster about that, so we invite everyone to attend. And I'm not going to talk about our work together on curriculum over the many decades because, thank God, I won't bore you with all of that. But I am struck by the assemblage of chairs in this room today. David himself, Winka, Bill Braham, John Dixon Hunt, Franca, and myself. It's quite an assemblage of academic furniture, old and new. And although the highest rank of faculty in our university is known as standing, as academic administrators, each of us spend a great deal of our lives, many hours, perhaps too many hours, sitting in an actual chair. The Topaz Medallion was awarded to David, and I want to quote excellence in architectural education, given we can assume with the understanding that teaching is perhaps the most important component of education, but it's not the only one. Just as sitting is a poor description of the life of a department chair, a four-legged chair is a poor description of the life of an academic. A more appropriate image of a piece of furniture representing academic life would be a three-legged stool, a seat supported by the interconnected triad of scholarly publication, teaching, and administrative service. Today I'd like to say a few words not about the academic leg of David's scholarly publications. I'm reserving those for the international group of scholars who will be assembling here for the fest shift, and won't in any way talk about the administrative accomplishments, which are many. So the administrative academic leg is off of my agenda today. But I would like to say a bit about the other of David's three academic legs. If you can imagine David as an academic stool, you'll perhaps be able to make this connection. David is a rare teacher. He's equally compelling while standing at a podium in a lecture course, seated at a table in a seminar, or face-to-face in a one-on-one advising meeting. But the leg of David's teaching is wider than most. His teaching is equally effective in the design studio, in the desk crit, a midterm review, a pinup, and as John knows, as we all do, a final review. So most of our work together in teaching and curriculum development since we joined the faculty over 35 years ago has been focused on the critical importance of theory courses as co-requisites to design studios. This was our intention when we originally developed and taught together with the late Marco Frescari, the first and second year theory courses as co-requisites to design studios in the MArch program. Recently, the critical and necessary connection between theory and design has been developed by David and taught in the fourth year of the undergraduate program. And while David understands why and how theory is taught on the doctoral level in the absence of design studios, he remains steadfastly committed, even more so today, to the idea that the teaching of architectural design at the University of Pennsylvania should be grounded and simultaneously challenged by the study of theory. In closing, I would like to say, like any piece of good academic furniture, David's three legs, scholarly, publication, teaching, and administrative service, are of unequal width and unequal length. Much like his understanding of architecture, eloquently expressed in numerous publications, the dimension of David's three academic legs have changed over time and continue to change in relation to specific circumstances and opportunities. I'll end my comments with a simple question. Have you ever noticed how most four-legged stools are usually square or rectangular, although they sometimes have rounded edges and rounded corners? But three-legged stools, both actual and academic, are usually round or oval. Curvilinearity, no less in furniture making than in architecture or education, is more complex than orthogonality, perhaps also implicitly more accommodating. Though never didactic, David's teaching over the decades has been similarly complex, subtle yet profound, a bit like a compound curve, often inexplicable, unable to be unfolded. And like any good curveball thrown by an academic pitcher at the top of his game, students have found David's teaching to be sometimes difficult to catch and always impossible to bat away. Thank you.
We're going to introduce David now. And in doing so, we're trying to redress what we weren't able to do in 2020, and that is actually give the award to David. I mean, clearly, he's gotten the award already, but not in front of this community. So if David would come up, we'll give him the Topaz Medallion. You can wear it.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, those of you who've traveled a distance, and thanks for the wonderful recollections and observations. It's really overwhelming. I haven't been idle in the months since I retired. John Hunt and I are finishing a book. The title you might find interesting. It's called Book of Ruins. Please don't see that as autobiographical. I'm also finishing a book on a subject I have always called, remain attached to, really, urban architecture. And what's delightful about this project is that, apart from my own text, the other chapters, 6 of them, are authored by former PhD students with whom I took great pleasure in collaborating once again. But the main thing I wanted to say about that book, which is also being finished these days, is that the roles of teacher and student are reversed. The concluding chapter to that book has a contradiction for a title. It's an important term in my current thinking, whole parts. That's the way the book ends, whole parts. The thesis is this, that single works of architecture, by design and through construction, must be entire and whole in themselves. This verges toward autonomy, and I think rightly so. But there is something in the makeup of every good work that indicates its necessary engagement with, maybe dependence on, conditions that were never designed and an architect cannot control. Air and light and view, but also, and more importantly, I think, cultural norms. This is to say that while the work is whole, it is by definition partial. It requires counterparts, which I think Hunt understands to be orientation otherwise. It's paradoxical, but perhaps the best works are not those that are entire and self-same, but rather by virtue of that, recognize and celebrate their engagement with others. I believe it's necessary for professors to profess. Each of us in this room and elsewhere, each of us has a voice through which one's stance is made public. When thought is voiced publicly in seminars, lectures, in the studio, as I've tried to do over the years, it seems plain to me that thought is refined, developed, and enriched, at least mostly. My thesis here, and I don't have much to say, is that when it comes to teaching, and maybe one's life generally, the radical foundation for creative thought is dialogue. Whatever strengths they may have, the lectures, seminars, articles, books, it seems to me that they depend in a large measure on my own engagement with the people in this room and those who preceded and maybe will follow you, for which I am infinitely grateful. Thank you very much.